Hi again then guys, and welcome to the very first bike review from the second ride game. This is of course not the first time we've talked about bikes on the channel, but it is the first time that we've featured Ride 2. Now we've covered Ride 1 before, number of episodes, number of bikes, and we will be covering the third game as well. But what better place to start with Ride 2 than with my favourite bike manufacturer, in fact, Bimota. Now Bimota is my favourite brand to the point where the livery of this channel is even inspired by them, the white, red and black. But when it comes to this bike in particular, not so much, because this is a quintessentially Italian bike in terms of having great expectations of what it could do. It was ambitious to the stars, but then unfortunately just didn't quite nail the execution. And that, of course, is something that you'll commonly see in Italian vehicles, not just bikes, but cars as well, but especially back in the day. The 80s for cars, the 90s for Italian motorbikes. Now, the birth of this idea behind the 500 V2, or V-twin in English, is stringent laws in the 90s. Laws regarding emissions in the bike world, which of course affected two-stroke bikes very heavily due to their nature. And that left manufacturers with relatively few options. You could either improve your two-stroke bikes, or you could ditch them in favour of something else. What Bimota chose to do was the former. They wanted to improve the quality of a two-stroke bike. So they created this, and in fact, although the bike itself may not look or on paper seem to be a remarkable, first ever record vehicle in any way, it actually is. This is the first ever fuel-injected electronic ignition two-stroke. That's awesome. I mean, regardless of how good or bad it is, they did that first. And for a brand that's as tiny as they are, that's impressive. Now, Bimotas tend to be known more so for their handling and for their exclusivity rather than brutish straight-line power, although that's not to say that their bikes are slow. Of course not. My favourite Bimota of all time is the YB6, a bike which could do 170 miles per hour in the mid-80s. Very impressive stuff. But this one, it's not exactly a YB6. Now, as the name suggests, it's a half a litre, 499cc, and what they did to try and overcome these emissions problems came along with great claims. They claimed that this bike could meet those emissions laws, but could also bring the heat to bikes which were 750, 800, even 1000cc and still compete. Unfortunately, when it was produced, all 340 of them, it couldn't. But it wasn't necessarily because the bike itself was bad. It was because it had some major issues involving, for instance, the crankcase, which led to crank seal problems, and ultimately it killed a lot of what the bike could have ever done. Now, ironically, this is one of the very few vehicles that we've talked about on the channel where it actually performs better now in 2019 than it ever did in 1997, because in the years since its production and since it almost single-handedly caused Bimota to go bankrupt in 99 and later revived, etc., they've since found that you can actually retool and refit the bike with, for instance, better crank casings, and it solves the issues. It makes it far more reliable and makes it actually work in the way that it was intended to. So it's one of the very few cult classic vehicles that actually gets better with time instead of worse, and it's always cool when that happens. It doesn't really happen that often, but this is a perfect example of that. Now, in terms of its performance, of course, a 500 V-twin, although it could be great, it's never going to be something that's going to, destroy everything else out there. Now, arguably, it's not trying to, but they kind of claimed that it could at the time. And of course, marketing is everything, but what the bike could actually do just doesn't match up to those claims, especially in the later 90s where things are really heating up. Now, the engine, as I said, is that 499cc. You're looking at a pretty healthy 111 horsepower. Doesn't sound like a massive amount, but for a bike, that's very good. And it also has 90 newton meters of torque, not pound-feet, of course, not the same. And in terms of weight, it's 160 kilos, which, to put that into perspective, is a good, say, 40 kilos lighter than a Ducati 748 from around 1995. So again, pretty good comparison. But a lightweight Bimota, potentially good through corners, that doesn't really sound like anything new. Bimotas are kind of known for that. Now, in terms of where it falls in the game, it sits at 475 pp points. That sounds decent, it's moderate, not overly high, and I think that that's about right. It's not the kind of bike that really should be any higher than that, because although in the game the reliability issues, of course, are not a problem, it doesn't affect it, you can still feel some of the issues that the bike has just from a design point of view. Now, one of the common criticisms that the bike had in real life is something that you can feel in the game, and that is that the power delivery is all high-end. You have to work it so hard, and when you've only got a 500cc engine to be working with, you don't really want to be wringing everything out of it all the time. Not because it will break, but because you just need to have more power and torque available more often than that. And if you're going to bring the heat to bikes with bigger capacities and more lazy torque delivery, or at least more torque on offer, you've got to have a lot to work with, and unfortunately the bike just doesn't. Even by late 90s standards, you're looking at just over 140 flat out, which of course for what it is good, but again, in the grand scheme of things, especially in a game where you can put it up against newer bikes with similar capacities, older bikes, bikes of its time, it's got to be able to still bring something to the table that makes it worthwhile. And for 32,000 credits, that's pretty hefty for a two-stroke 500cc that doesn't really get much above 140. That's pretty hefty. So I can't exactly recommend this bike for somebody who's looking to just dominate. At 500cc, there are faster options, there are certainly cheaper options, but for collectors, for people such as myself who are aficionados of more oddball and technologically advanced stuff, and very historically significant stuff, certainly in this case, then it's the bike for you. It's far more of a collector's piece that's just fun to ride, rather than something that's going to dominate the track. It has performance, the handling is good, it's smooth, it's a pretty compact, lightweight bike, and it is easy to work with, but that was never the issue. People always complimented its handling. It was always the straight line power, or lack thereof, especially low end, and you can feel that in the game. So ultimately, that's my recommendation. It's a great little bike in its own way, very fun to ride, and if you've got the spare credits, then sure, give it a try. But it's far from being the best showcase of what Bimotas can do, even for its time, and my ultimate verdict is just keep it as that collector's piece that it is. For that, it's fantastic. Don't try and make it anything more than that though, because it just isn't really. Not by today's standards anyway. But overall, that's it for my review. Of course, if you want to see all of my other bike reviews, not just in this game, but in tons of others too, then you can click the playlist here on screen. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.